Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Office Hours, a podcast series by Lifelong Learning, where we go behind the scenes with our faculty instructors to talk more about their courses, their own research passions, and why this is meaningful for the world. I'm Dr. Nathan Cost. I'm joined here today by Dr. Phillis Isabella Sheppard. Dr. Sheppard is the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Chair, Professor of Religion, Psychology and Culture and Womanist Thought, the former director of the James Lawson Institute for the Research and Study of Nonviolent Movements. Dr. Sheppard just finished recording her third lecture for her upcoming lifelong learning course, Learning from the Desert Mothers. Phyllis, welcome to Office Hours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I will also say Phyllis is a great friend of lifelong learning. She's one of these folks that is already doing it regularly, working with community members and we're just so thrilled to have you here, Phyllis. Now, my first question for you is, without using your job title or the word professor, what do you do?
What do I do? It's interesting. I usually don't think of my job title when I think about what I do. What I think about is what I'm called to do. And so I primarily walk with people in an education institution, in a divinity school, but walk with people as they try to determine the ways in which they are to be in the world in a way that is transformative for the spaces where they meet, live, love, and work, but also transformative for themselves. So at the end of the day, I see what I do as responding to this deep ethical, I might even say, ethical call to be about the care of the world and preparing those who are trying to do the same. That happens to involve teaching, speaking, research as well.
You've worn many hats in your career. At what point did you arrive at the description that you just used?
You'll probably laugh, but by the age of 12, I knew that I would be a professor. I knew that I would integrate religion and psychology, and I knew that I would integrate work around justice and care for the whole world. I can't say a particular day that happened. So, of course, it's a long path to actually making that happen in a way that it becomes a career. But I would say definitely before my doctoral studies, I knew I had a clearer path. But when I first started teaching, one of my very first classes, 50% of the class was in the community, working with community organizers. The institution where I was at the time, that was not the norm. And it hit me that, well, this is part of what I will be doing, holding space between, we would say, the academy and the world, the church, and people's everyday lives. So very early, I would say, in the first.
We don't use the term intersectional with vocation very often, but that's really what I hear when you describe your journey as vocationally intersectional.
Yes, in a way that at least I hope is a natural flow. So that sort of interlocking realities that we engage, I like to think of it as not as an effort to be intersectional, but that there's a flow to it, that it's natural because it's what the world demands in many ways.
Thank you for that answer. Let's jump into the Desert Mothers. So first of all, let's start at the ground level. Who or what are the Desert Mothers, and what are they trying to do, or what's the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. My notion or my idea of who and what the Desert Mothers are or were has changed over the years. And by what I mean is that when I first started learning about the existence of Desert Mothers, I myself was a nun, a Sister of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana. And so I sort of thought of them through that lens. And it's been many years that I've no longer a member of that community, but I continue to read in this area primarily for devotional, spiritual practices of my own. But then when I began to put their lives in dialogue with other reading I was doing around women, primarily around first feminists and womanists, I began to realize that that the Desert Mothers were real women who, for a variety of reasons, left their homes, left the expectations that society in the third and fourth century expected of women, and they went into the desert because they wanted to be closer to God. But when you listen or read their narratives, you realize that this wanting to be closer to God was fueled also by a recognition of a need to be transformed in a space that diminished much of the clatter of the life they were expected to live. So who are they? Historically, they existed, but they're also, I think of them as teachers calling us into silence, into solitude, and into action. So a lot of times we think of them as they go off into the desert and they're totally silent, but they have no knowledge of what is happening in the world. For instance, that people are hungry. People are hungry because they need food, and people are hungry for deep spiritual awakening. In very powerful ways, they respond to both of those. They also respond to, and I talk about this in one of the lectures, but at the time they're doing this, the emerging what becomes the church, earlier Jesus followers, now it's building up and there's becoming this institution called the church that's connecting with states, the Roman Empire states, Constantine's work. And for some, like the Desert Mothers, that intermingling interrupted, clouded the kind of clear sight that you need to live a deep spiritual life that's transformative. So they went to the desert. So they're both real and metaphorical for us, I think.
Yeah. So we're
Yeah.
talking about 4th and 5th century primarily. Is that right?
Mhm, mhm.
Not exclusively,
Primarily.
but that was where we begin to see a real emergence of this phenomenon of desert mothers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Phyllis, what is it about the desert
Mm,
that they were drawn to? When I'm assuming there were, if we're talking about North Africa, perhaps, there are
mhm.
other areas of wilderness. What do you think the desert, what was it that drew them there?
I think in many ways, and this would be true for the Desert Fathers as well, but the landscape, that it was stark, that it was, I mean, think about it. The desert is a place that managing to stay alive in the desert took work, but it was wide open, not surrounded with buildings, etc. So I think that appeal of this sort of, I think the desert represented the interior life that potentially outside of, as I said, the clutter and the noise of social political struggles presented the possibility of a different world, almost, it's like a canvas. But at the same time, it was very obvious that the world that was desired would require a long struggle in the desert. I mean, it also makes sense when we think about the place of the desert in biblical narratives. There's so many stories. I talk about Hagar at one point being sent to the desert to live or die. I think about obviously traveling in the desert for 40 years or being in the desert, there's no water, and finally water is found. So the desert looks unforgiving, it looks harsh, it looks almost cruel. It's so hard to live there. But springs pop up. And for them, for the desert dwellers, these were spiritual, life changing springs. So, yes, I think it provided imagery that suggested life, but also suggested the reality of struggle in the spiritual life.
And that reality of struggle is so key. It's so essential to understanding what the desert mothers are trying to do.
Mm,
I believe in one of your lectures you refer to it as, and I'm using air quotes, your spiritual warfare, right? That there
right.
is
And
that there is a very real and deep internal struggle that is
yes, yes,
required.
yes, yes.
Could you
Yes.
elaborate on that?
So most of the desert mothers and desert teachers talk about spiritual warfare. And I think it's because they have a very acute awareness of the interior life. So this spiritual warfare is about obvious temptations that we could name, but also some which are more subtle and we might even say, using a now Western term, but unconscious. That is the warfare against one's desire for instance, to hold on to attachments that don't foster the spiritual life and disguising those attachments. So greed is not just about, I want that over there, but it's about a disposition toward life. That's a deep struggle. It's one thing to say, I will not have a sense of greed for money, food, or those kind of things. But what about the greed of wanting to be considered and acknowledged as special all the time? That's not a conscious thought. And they talk about that, that it's not about pride of because people are coming to you as a desert mother seeking help. So those kinds of spiritual warfare, the spiritual warfare that disrupts. So, some of them created monasteries, and living in a monastery, you're in a relational context up close and personal all the time. Well, the spiritual warfare of loving your sisters while maybe wanting to have what they have, for instance, wanting to be recognized or more learned or wanting to have the privilege of maybe leaving and coming back, those kinds of things. So the spiritual warfare is a constant reality. One of the Desert Mothers speaks about the spiritual warfare as the temptation to give in to boredom. So, you think of some of the spiritual practices of being in prayer, of being silent. Well, our minds are accustomed to being filled with all kinds of things. The path to that kind of deep silence can be cluttered with a feeling of boredom and the feelings that arise because we feel bored, anger, loss, grief, all of that. So this spiritual warfare, I think they do a very good job of presenting the psyche or the self as complex and complicated, much like Paul said, that which I would do, I do not, meaning I longed for the spiritual life, but what it requires sometimes has me not pursuing it.
There are so many reasons why I love that you're teaching this course. Among those are the fact that you, former nun, psychoanalyst, womanist theologian, numerous vocational intersections and academic intersections that can speak to the experience of the Desert Mothers on multiple levels. I believe is it Syncletica of Alexandria who is describing sort of an inner psychological landscape or landscape of the self.
Mm.
What do you see as a psychoanalyst when you read the Desert Mothers?
Oh my, that's a great question. Well, for one thing, I see some similarities that I see today with folks who come from for psychoanalysis or spiritual direction. And that is these are women who, I mean, as you say, I've touched on it before, but whose interior lives are complicated. So one way to read them is through a totally spiritual lens and say, they wanted to be closer to God, which they did. They wanted to grow deeper in their own spiritual life. And that is true. But all of them have a piece of their narrative that is more complicated than that. Either, let's say, for instance, their family expected them to marry and, they run off in the night or the afternoon and manage to escape to the desert from that particular life. That's a complex idea. Does that undo the deep longing for the spiritual life? No. On the one hand, we might say it may demonstrate this willingness to do whatever is necessary to pursue this life. But it also demonstrates a capacity to do whatever's necessary to leave the life that has been imposed on them by social constraints. So I see a very complicated interior psychology. These are women who talked about love, the necessity of love, whose love was reserved for the many as opposed to the dyadic, the one, the special one. That takes a psychology that has wrestled a bit with oneself. So I continue to be inspired by the fact that with complex psychologies, conflicting hopes and dreams, when you're in conflict with your family, when you're in conflict with society, these are women who primarily talked about having achieved deeply satisfying lives by taking paths not carved out for them, not clear, and they're finding their way to desert spiritualities, desert ways of living, caring about those who hunger in multiple ways. Yeah. What I would add is we don't need to ignore the dimensions of their lives that might strike us as more social and not spiritual. These go together. So they're really talking about a psychology of integration way before Freud and Kohut and those psychoanalysts that we reference a lot.
One of the things that I was struck by in listening, particularly to lecture 2, was
Mhm,
the complexity of their lives, even though it sounds like on paper they go off to the desert, they're simplifying their lives, or they're living austere lives, ascetic
mhm.
lives, but they are, in a sense, living connected to a community somewhere, right? And they're also still navigating gender norms,
Wow,
shared
yes, absolutely.
expectations. I'm not gonna say it because I'll butcher it, but
Oh, wait.
could you tell the story of, was it of Theodora, who lived
Yes,
most of her life
yes, yes, fascinating.
disguised as a man, and what her
Yes,
experience and what that could show us about the lives that they lived?
yes. Theodora was married, we understand. She was married, but she had an affair, and she decided that as part of her penance and repentance, that she would go to the desert and live a life seeking to be forgiven for having an adulterous affair. But she also knew that she couldn't just pack up and leave because A, she didn't think her husband would let her, and she knew that there were some women who were already gathered in the desert. Some monasteries had been formed, but she thought that her husband would be able to find her too quickly, the story goes. So she disguised herself as a man, entered a men's community, and lived there, I think, 7 years, maybe 8 years, as a monk with them, became very well known as someone who was empathic, insightful around the spiritual life. And she lived there as a man until a woman, not in one of the other communities, but a seeker who came and settled in the area. Anyway, this woman gets pregnant and she says that it is this monk, Theodora, who is the father. Now we can imagine the complexity there because to deny that the child is hers, the only way that can be proven is to prove that she's a woman. So instead, Theodora is kicked out of the monastery. She and the child, who was a baby boy, and they live in the desert, but outside the monastery for the next 7 years. People continue to come and seek guidance, etc., until the monastery decides, okay, it's been 7 years. We think she's been forgiven, primarily by God. So they allow Theodora to come back to the monastery with the child, who obviously is now around 7. And Theodora continues to live as a man, and they do not discover that she has the body of a woman until she dies. Now, I think that's a very complex narrative because one of the things that strikes me is that Theodora seems comfortable living as a man. At least the pieces of the narrative that we have left do not indicate that that this was a struggle living as a man. It almost seems a comfort, and that in some ways it freed her up to pursue the spiritual life and be the spiritual teacher and guide that she was called to be. What that means about how gender was understood. I mean, how is it that you can spend your whole life living with a group as a man? I mean, one way of thinking about it is they expected to see a man and therefore they saw a man. But it should make us think about the many questions that we continue to wrestle with around gender, even sexuality. So this woman in town says, "This is who got me pregnant." Who did she see when she looked at Theodore? She saw a man.
There's one other, uh, anecdote from the Desert Mothers. I believe it's Sarah of the Desert, or Amasera, who is
Mhm.
approached by two great men, air quotes, "great
Yes.
men."
Yes.
And
Yes.
will you
Yeah.
describe that exchange?
Sure. These 2 elders, great men, are coming to visit her, but they're coming with, we might say, not pure hearts. They want to trick her. In fact, they refer to her as this old woman. And so they basically say to her, you need to be careful that you don't become prideful because all these people think that you're this great anchoress, a hermit dweller who teaches that, they'll think you will think about yourself. They think that I'm great and, that I'm spiritually mature, etc. And she responds, on the outside, I am a woman, but on the inside, my thoughts are different. And I read that as, I think it can be read a couple ways, but I read that as her saying, on the outside, you are able to see a woman, so you can project these negative, both social and religious stereotypes onto me, meaning the idea that because she's a woman, that pride would automatically be a part of her psychology that she had to overcome, according to the two elders. But she says, on the inside, my thoughts are different. In other words, she has this sense of self that says, I'm not prideful. I don't think that I'm better or bigger than everyone else because people seek spiritual guidance from me. And so she basically dismisses them. They think of her as somewhat, not only as prideful, and that they could easily have her fall into quote unquote the sin of pride, but they don't think that she will answer in the way that she does. She does not attack them. She doesn't say, you're wrong, you're this. She basically says, I know who I am, and that's how I show up. I also think the story is powerful as we think about gender, because if she's saying that on the outside I'm a woman, but on the inside my thoughts are different, what exactly might be those thoughts about gender that are inside? She doesn't tell us what those are, but I think we can rightly imagine that she's saying, however you understand gender, I don't understand it that way. My thoughts are different. Yeah. So therefore, how we think theologically and psychologically about embodiment, and especially along the lines of gender.
Will you say more about that then? The potential?
The potential, I think the potential is, we are still very much tied to how our bodies look in terms of telling us who we are and who we're supposed to be, and how that should be mirrored to us. For instance, two men come along and says, you're an old woman who's prideful. We might say that's negative mirroring, but that there's a capacity for understanding oneself outside the constraints of how the body is socially determined to tell us what we are and who we are. Today, we think about this in terms of gender expression. Clearly, in that narrative, there's a way that a woman is supposed to respond to two great elders, and she didn't respond to it. So that's on a minimal level. Connected to Theodora, it's like we think we know what a woman and a man look like when they show up in their clothes and walk a certain way, and we can rightly guess or lightly define them in a certain way. I think that both of those narratives should make us give thought about our theological anthropologies. What does it mean to be human? But beyond that, what does it mean to be gendered in a way that is primarily based on social expectations and norms? And when we begin to resist those, what does that say about who we are theologically? Yeah. It makes us think about a lot of the discussion around transgender, what is being transitioned, what is being transformed, what is in transition. I would say that they should make us realize theologically that these are not new questions. And we like to think that they are, but no, these questions about what it means to be human, along with what it means to be any gender, they give us food for thought. Give us food for thought. And I think that's going to be a path that we're on for a long time.
If we're still wrestling with these questions.
We're still wrestling with these questions. And so glad you said that, because we're still wrestling with them, and we're wrestling with them religiously as integral to deep religious question, deep spiritual questions. So absolutely.
Phyllis, I'm going to stop saying how much I love this course. Okay, I'm going to stop prefacing my questions with that. But I think one of the ways that this course is incredibly relevant to the conversations we're having today, or maybe why I think it's so fascinating, is that we're talking about a group of women, 4th and 5th century, living in the desert, pursuing spiritual transformation, trying to understand the self. It would be a very different context than you and I sitting in our offices at VDS.
Mm-hmm.
But we're still asking the same questions. And it's this enduring relevance of the desert mothers
Mhm.
that we're still able to better understand ourselves through their work.
Mhm. Yes.
And I'm wondering if there are other areas that you see where their lives and their lived experiences connect to the lived experience of folks in 2026.
Mhm. Well, one of the things that I'm finding quite fascinating right now are the number of like websites, for instance, where the spiritual lives of desert mothers is a catalyst for contemporary Christians who are indeed living in cities where there's, clatter, noise, etc., both with people and with political, all kinds of noise that we live in and respond to. So I think one of the things that they remind us is that it is not the city as in the concrete city. It is not the desert in the concrete desert, but it is what those spaces call us to. And I think both of them, the desert and the city, being juxtaposed that way, call us to deep engagement with ourselves and the spiritual teachings, but deep engagements with the deep concerns that are underneath some of the noise, underneath some of the struggles that we face, the struggles around justice, the struggles around social care, the struggles to protect the earth, even. Because when you read about the desert mothers, the connection to the earth, there's an earth theology in many of those narratives. So my point is that the message for today, one of the desert mothers says this, not in these words, but wherever you go, you take you with you. Another one says, get out and feed the hungry that show up. The point I'm making is that these are not disengaged lives. This is an engaged spiritual life beyond the me, myself, and I. And I think that's a constant message that the spiritual life requires us to be concerned with, in love with, and engaged with beyond the personal. But the personal has to be transformed and be able to do that in a way that is not destructive, that is not harmful. Who is it? Laura Swan talks about the way the desert mothers were very conscious of the potential for the abuse of power in the seeker, teacher, spiritual guide relationship. Multiply that, and we see a world gone awry when power is ignored or power is denied. So I think there are multiple messages for us to be learning from and using in our daily lives. I certainly think about particularly the issue of power, the way in which it can be manipulated and it can be spiritualized to the detriment of those who are really trying to find their way in the world as people who are deeply concerned with the world and deeply spiritual.
I know we have to wrap up here, but I've got two more questions for you. What have you learned from the desert mothers?
Yes, yes. One of the things that struck me today as I was preparing for another class I'm teaching, which is Black Buddhist teachings and practices. And it struck me that there are some wonderful similarities about what it takes to be engaged in the spiritual life, formational kinds of questions. So I think one of the things I'm learning is that some of these lessons that the Desert Mothers teach us go across spiritual lineages, if you will, meaning, in Buddhism, particularly practices of meditation, this call to stillness is to notice what's in one's mind, but also to notice how it interferes with deepening in silence, stillness. But smack in the middle of that, you hear about, this call to be engaged in the transformation of the world. So I think my point is that within and across religious families, there are red threads that are crucial to follow if we're going to have a meaningful spiritual life and if we're going to actually recognize the state of the world that we're in and be involved in its transformation. And both talk about to this issue around attachment. We can actually be attached to things that are not yet. We can be attached to a vision, a mission, etc. So much so that it actually interferes with what can possibly emerge.
Like a dream of something that we
Like a dream, yes,
want to see happen. Is that what I hear
that
you
we
saying?
want to see happen, yes. And we can be so attached to it that what is happening, which is beautiful, loving, and real because it's what's here, we miss it. Yeah.
The desert mothers just won't let us put them in a box, Phyllis.
Will not let us put them in a box, will not let us, what's the word I want? Think that we've arrived in some false way.
Mhm.
There is
Yeah.
no arriving, there is traveling, there is journey.
So let me ask you this then. This is the desert mothers are not new to you, but you haven't taught a course on the desert mothers
I have
before.
not taught a course. No, no.
Tell me, why did you decide to teach a course on the desert mothers at this moment? What piqued your interest?
Mhm. You know, on one level, probably I would say that one of the motivations is personal, my own attention to spiritual life, deepening in the practices of meditation, stillness, silence, and being a highly engaged person in my various contexts. I recognize that the people who come to me for spiritual guidance were asking about the kinds of questions and the kinds of practices that the desert mothers were teaching. These are folks who they've heard something about the potential in these kind of practices, this kind of deep listening that the desert mothers talk about, but were very unfamiliar with the ways in which to grow in this area. And I realize there have been students as well who've asked around these kinds of questions, but who also want to make sure that their answers are coming from a specific Christian focus. They wanted to find out if they could pursue this path without having to leave the church that they love. Um, the religious perspective, being Christians, if you will. And the answer is no. I'm forgetting who the person was who said, I began to read Buddhism and I became basically a, a deeper Christian. And that's what I think when people ask about, are there places within Christianity where pursuing this kind of spiritual practice is possible? Yes. And it's not that we start with the desert mothers and say, yeah, you've got to go back to the third century and that's it. No, we could travel all the way through up till today and find these calls and these practices that lead to deep contemplation and deep engagement. So again, as you know, I started out by saying there's this deep ethical pull in me that gets expressed through teaching, gets expressed through the varieties of things I do as a professor. This is one of them. Yeah, this is one of.
Well, let's end on this last question.
All righty.
I've asked what you've learned from the desert mothers. What do you hope your students will learn when they encounter the desert mothers?
Yes, yes. Well, depending on where our student, who the student is and what their background is, we sometimes get students, we get a section that have been raised in the church, some denomination or another, and they have been what I like to call good representatives of their denomination or the church, very good. So much so that the actual spiritual dimension is somewhat lost on them. So what I hope is that it makes students think back to imagine. I want students to imagine a time before all the whatever rules they learn in their denomination, etc., that there was a time in which Jesus followers at the heart of it was this following into deep practices of devotion, prayer, what is now and say, silence, stillness, as absolutely necessary to the life of faith. So I'm not saying throw those other things out, but these are absolutely necessary to the life of faith, especially a faith that is engaged in the world. Our students are responding to what's happening in the world, whether it's congregational ministry, whether it's nonprofit, whatever it is, that this red thread has to go through it. And two, I hope students learn that these practices are essential because without spiritual practices that make one take stock of themselves and what they're encountering, what will sustain them when the hard times arise? And we hear every day that the hard times are here. They've never not been here, but what keeps one in the work to which you were actually called? I believe it's community, deep spiritual practices, and an openness to be called again and again into a life of faith over and over. Almost, there are people who say every morning, they're married, and they say every morning I get up and I have to agree to myself to maintain my marriage, my commitment, my vows. And I think that's true, that every day part of our spiritual practice is saying yes again to that which we're called.
What a note to end on. I want
Mm.
that, Phyllis. What you just described, I want that. And I want that for our students. That's the mission. I just think that's the theological project. Dr. Phillis Isabella Sheppard, thank you for your time.
Thank you for
Learning
having
from
me.
the Desert Mothers, asynchronous online lifelong learning course is open for registration now and will be launching here in the next few weeks. So I'd encourage you to check it out. Thank you for this office hours episode.